Vote counting gets underway after an independence referendum in Ukraine's eastern regions. Forces loyal to Kiev press on with their anti-terrorist operations in eastern Ukraine, seizing polling stations and shooting unarmed civilians. Iran's supreme leader slams Western expectations for Tehran to curb its missile development, calling it stupid and idiotic. And over 40 Iraqi soldiers are killed after being abducted in separate militant attacks. Hello there, you're watching AEE World News and I'm Fatima Basim. Following a high voter turnout, polls have closed in an independence referendum in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Up to 3 million people are believed to have participated in the vote for self-determination in the turbulent eastern part of Ukraine.
Despite the threat of violence and intimidation from the self-proclaimed government in Kiev and Western warnings of sanctions, thousands of residents in eastern Ukraine bravely casted their ballots in an independence referendum.
The voting went really well. People were coming to us like it's a holiday. Today for Luhansk residents in general, it's a holiday. The referendum is not only a big holiday in our city, but in the whole of Donbass, where the referendum is being held. The turnout is really big.
Some 1,471 polling stations in the Luhansk region and around 1,500 in Donetsk opened their doors for voters at 8 a.m. before closing 12 hours later. The paper had one simple question: do you approve of independence for the People's Republic of Donbass? Early reports suggested 80% turnout, but nothing has been confirmed yet. Around 3 million out of the 6.7 million residents in the regions were expected to take part in the vote.
I surely will vote. This is our right. This is our country. I will vote and make my country get on the track, which we expected through elections. When I saw that the interim government had taken such illegal actions towards us, I decided to vote for myself.
In the town of Mariupol, recovering from Friday's deadly clashes, only 8 polling stations had been opened, but the turnout has been higher than expected.
I want to be independent from everyone. Yugoslavia broke up and they live well now.
We have come to fight for our rights and become independent, and we are happy that we've been given the right to voice our opinion. If we're independent, it will be hard at the beginning, but it will be better than being with the fascists.
While the government in Kiev has dismissed the referendum and the US called it illegal, it seems the people in eastern Ukraine are determined to secede and create the world's newest nation.
Well, the European Union said it will not recognize the results of that independence referendum in eastern Ukraine. According to the EU Foreign Policy Chief Spokeswoman, the organisers of the referenda have no democratic legitimacy and their organisation runs counter to the objectives of the joint Geneva statement to de-escalate tensions.
Presidential elections on the 25th of May. On his call to postpone local referendum in the eastern part of
Meanwhile, Kiev has responded to that referendum by pushing ahead with its military operations in eastern Ukraine. Deadly clashes were reported on the outskirts of Slavyansk, while in another town, Kiev's National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed civilians, leaving at least one person dead.
The sound of bullets was deafening as they flew out in flaming arcs, lighting the dawn sky of Slavyansk. The Ukrainian army has carried on with its so-called anti-terrorist operation in the country's eastern Donetsk region in an attempt to disrupt a regional referendum due to begin hours later.
I would like to inform you that the anti-terrorist operations in Krasny Liman Slovyansk and Kramatorsk are in their final stage. 8 operational groups have destroyed separatist bases and checkpoints within the framework of the anti-terrorist operation.
A checkpoint of the self-defense forces came under attack. There was about 10 minutes of unceasing heavy gun and mortar fire coming from the nearby local TV tower, which had earlier been occupied by Kiev forces. Meanwhile, in the Luhansk region, the Ukrainian army attacked Novy Dar, with some 15 APCs spotted near the village. Reports of sightings of Ukrainian APCs in various towns and villages in the region have been coming in throughout the day. One report said that as many as 45 APCs were moving from the Kharkov region in the direction of Luhansk. Disrupting the referendum, Kiev's armed forces entered a town in the Donetsk region and seized 4 polling stations. As residents in the town gathered around the local administrative building, security forces loyal to Kiev responded by opening fire on unarmed civilians. At least 1 person has been confirmed dead, with the death toll expected to rise. Voting in 4 other towns across the Luhansk region has also been interrupted as military vehicles blocked passage to polling centers.
The cars with ballots and protocols were blocked by the troops, by the National Guard. Armored personnel carriers and armored vehicles stopped our cars, which they blocked so they couldn't go anywhere.
But with residents in the eastern regions showing their unwavering resolve in seeing the independence referendum through, it seems unlikely that forces loyal to Kiev will be able to prevent the regions from asserting their independence.
Let's speak to political analyst Ross Fitzgerald, who joins us from our Beirut studios. Ross, people in eastern Ukraine weren't even considered to take part in the international talks to de-escalate the crisis in Ukraine. Don't you think a referendum is their only peaceful option?
I think you make a good point. Really what we're seeing now is some of the blowback from the legitimacy questions that were raised at the time of the revolution, if you like, in Kiev. The representation of people from the east of the country was notably lacking at that time, and really when you've gone through a process like they did, removing an elected president, albeit one who was widely seen as corrupt and failing his people, you really need to be pushing for legitimacy as a priority there. They didn't do that. They were more sort of immediate concerns for the new regime in Kiev, and they did not embrace the representatives from the eastern part of the country in a way that they should have. One of obviously the major tactical mistakes that they made was immediately clamping down on Russian language in the east. That caused an enormous backlash, and the sentiment really turned against Kiev then, because so many people in the east of Ukraine do speak Russian. At the time it was seen as a sort of an expression of new Ukrainian sovereignty and non-reliance on Russia. But in retrospect, I think that the government in Kiev, the new government in Kiev there, is probably regretting their failure to embrace those in the east. As to whether this was the only option, no, I don't think so. I think there are always options. This is one of those. The decision to go ahead with these referenda is really again an expression of frustration with the regime so far, and also viewing the opportunity that this presents for the people in the east. They see that there's chaos. They see that Kiev has loose controls over the institutions of state, and they're trying to take advantage of that now.
Do you think the fact that President Putin called for a delay in the vote signals a fear in the Kremlin that violence is bound to break out afterwards?
I think what it reflects, in fact, is that the Kremlin is very much aware that things could turn against Russia's interest, and we always, whenever you're dealing with Russia, it's difficult to second guess motivations coming out of Moscow. But the one thing to bear in mind is if there's a clear advantage to the Russian interest, it's obvious that they will be pursuing that, and that's something that they have been very consistent about in their foreign policy over the years. So I think really this reflected the fact that the Russians are seeing this and saying, well, hang on, maybe we do want a sort of a neutral Ukraine as a buffer state between, to an extent between Russia and the West. We do want a Ukraine which is working with Russia, not against Russia. But we certainly don't want a situation where goings on in eastern Ukraine have direct blowback for Russia. Russia cannot afford further sanctions being piled on this. Russia cannot afford to be associated with any kind of developments which are seen as crossing some sort of red line for the West. So Russia just needs to sort of gently manage this. And I think this was an expression there of Putin saying, well, maybe we do need to try and de-escalate this for the good of Russia. I don't think it was necessarily a comment on what was the best for the people of Ukraine or the eastern Ukraine in particular.
Do you think that the EU and the US also bear responsibility in trying to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine? Because they're always calling on Russia, but they are the ones that are putting the sanctions. They're the ones supporting the anti-terrorist operations.
I mean, that's true. I think the calls for de-escalation from the US and the EU are very much an acknowledgement of the realpolitik, the influence generally that Russia has. Now, in this case, it seems that there was a genuine desire on the part of Putin to avoid these referenda, and that has not gone his way. It hasn't certainly gone the way of the Western powers either. So this was in no one's interest. This was this was the people of eastern Ukraine doing what they felt empowered to do at the time. So, I think we can certainly say that this wasn't in anyone's interest. What you do have to acknowledge is that if anybody has sway over the Russian speakers of the eastern Ukraine and these irregular forces who are taking some sort of authority position in those areas, if anyone has influence there, it is Russia. So if anyone's going to be able to have any sort of sway there, it is Russia. I take your point that the restraint is also required from Kiev, but I would also caution that Kiev perhaps doesn't have as firm a grip as I've mentioned on the institutions of the state as we might expect from a regime that was more bedded in. For example, the armed forces who have been committing what sound like some sort of fairly major errors in killing civilians who are unarmed from the sounds of things in eastern Russia. It sounds like those armed forces, the official Ukrainian armed forces, have been doing this. Well, of course, these guys were reporting, 6 months ago to a very different setup in Kiev. Their loyalty is to the state, but at the same time, they're being blown in the wind as well. So it may be the fact that individual units or soldiers or commanders are not necessarily directly under the sort of strictest control from Kiev. So there's a balancing act. Certainly there could be more pressure put on Kiev, but we have to acknowledge that Kiev doesn't necessarily have full control over all areas either.
So are there fears among Kiev authorities that their actions in eastern Ukraine are counterproductive? That this is not the way to build a nation? No,
I mean, absolutely. This is playing out to nobody's playbook. This is not what anyone wanted, and the authorities in Kiev, the new government there, they will not have wanted this. This doesn't work for them. And absolutely, if it gets to the point where you have to use force to keep your nation together, where you have to use force against your own people to keep them part of your nation, we're going to see you see terrible long-term scars from that, and there will be fractures which will take many decades to heal coming out of this, no matter how it's resolved. The only way for the country to be built and for a sustainable Ukraine to go forward is through a hearts and minds campaign that would bring all of the constituent parts together. Now, it was lost in Crimea, and then Crimea was lost de facto, and then de jure as well. Now we're looking in the eastern Ukraine. At the moment they've lost the hearts and minds of the people of the eastern Ukraine. They haven't lost a de facto. They haven't lost power there de facto yet, necessarily, and they certainly are a long way from losing it de jure. Now, the challenge for Ukraine, for the authorities in Kiev, is how they can possibly get a consensual healing of that region and a reabsorption of those people into the Ukraine, where they are happy to be part of a prosperous, peaceful Ukraine going forward.
Yes, but how detached are they from what's going on in eastern Ukraine? They have created an independent force, the National Guard, which now consists of around 20,000 troops, which has a lot of this right sector, these neo-Nazi, what some may call thugs.
It's true that there are sort of right-wing elements that have been involved in this whole process from the beginning. I think it's also important that we don't overplay that either. There's an awful lot of propaganda that's been coming out, sort of reinforcing the role and the influence of the right wing, the fascists. So you saw that from your video report there, that the people of the eastern Ukraine who are opposed or who are in favour of some sort of separation from the west of Ukraine, they're referring to the fascists running the government. Now, in reality, that isn't the case. It is not that the fascists have taken over Kiev. There are genuinely fascist elements and paramilitary elements who were supporting the ouster of the former President Yanukovych, but that's not to say that they are running the show. Now, in terms of the military personnel, I think you're right that they will have a much larger role there, because that's their area of expertise to a great extent, the use of force and the threat of force. So again, what we're looking at here is a situation where Kiev cannot rely on its own authority over the armed forces, which are nominally under the control. Again, I don't want to overplay this either. It's not as if it's total chaos and no one can take responsibility for what the National Guard or the army are doing. However, I think it's important to bear in mind that there are small p politics at play within those groups, which will impact the big P politics of Ukrainian and international relations. So it's unclear at this point to what extent the fascists are sort of responsible for some of the kind of atrocities we're hearing about. But it may well be a fact that the fascists being there lessens Kiev's ability to rein them in or to necessarily control the actions of the troops on the ground.
All right, political analyst and journalist Ross Fitzgerald, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this.
Thank you.
Iran's Supreme Leader Sayyid Ali Khamenei criticized the West for demanding that the Islamic Republic limit its missile defense capabilities. The comments were made during a visit to the Revolutionary Guard's Central Command.
The West expects limits to Iran's missile program while persistently threatening Iran with military action. Therefore, such an expectation is stupid and foolish. The arrogant front is making efforts to bring the Iranian nation to its knees and force it to retreat, but will definitely not achieve this goal.
Meanwhile, Iranian President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani has dismissed Western allegations that the Islamic Republic is pursuing a secret nuclear program. Speaking during a ceremony in the Iranian capital Tehran to unveil 3 new types of nuclear medicine, President Rouhani reiterated that the country's nuclear energy program is peaceful and in line with non-proliferation treaty. The statement comes ahead of a fresh round of talks between Iran and the P5+1 group aimed at reaching a final agreement over the decade-long nuclear dispute.
We have nothing to put on the table and offer to them but transparency. That's it. Our nuclear technology is not up for negotiation. Iran will not retreat one step in the field of nuclear technology. We will not accept a nuclear apartheid.
While Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif held talks with Iranian President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani during his visit to the Islamic Republic. And as our Tehran correspondent Hussein Dabash explains now, the meeting could serve as a stepping stone to improving relations marred by mistrust.
Iranian President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani held talks with the visiting Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in Iran's capital Tehran. The two heads of state discussed the bilateral ties between Iran and Pakistan, including security and economic relations. The Pakistani premier, who was making his first visit to the Islamic Republic since taking power last year, arrived with a high-ranking delegation including the finance, petroleum, and economic ministers. The visit is seen as vital in resolving several outstanding issues between the two neighbors.
One of the issues between the two countries is the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, which has been delayed from the Pakistani side because of US pressures on Islamabad. Another is the tension between the two countries on the subject of kidnapping of the Iranian border guards by Pakistani gunmen. This can, in the future, affect Pakistan's trade with Iran. Pakistan is already benefiting very much from its ties with Iran. It is getting electricity from Iran and other raw materials that the country is in dire need of. Another issue of focus is Afghanistan and what happens after NATO troops leave at the end of this year.
Others argue that the current visit by the Pakistani premier can serve as a stepping stone for improving relations, which are currently stained by mistrust over a range of issues.
The problem really lies in the fact that the United States, the Saudi regime, and the Israelis have formed an alliance and are trying to pressure Pakistan and prevent the country from importing Iranian natural gas. This, of course, is not in the interest of the Pakistani people. It will keep the country starved of energy and make expenses much greater for the country. So the Iranians and the Pakistani government are going to speak about ways to see in which they could move forward with this project, and I think the Iranians expect the Pakistani government to show more independence.
Enhancing economic cooperation is high on the agenda for the visiting Pakistani premier, according to Islamabad. In fact, the two sides are expected to sign memorandums of understanding on economic and security cooperation. Relations between Iran and Pakistan are generally perceived here in Tehran as being close, but at the same time distant. Now, as far as this visit goes, the question still remains, will this visit by the Pakistani premier, whose political party has extensive ties with Iran's main competitor in the region, Saudi Arabia, bring about better relations between Islamabad and Tehran? Reporting for AEE TV, Hussein Dabash, Tehran.
Authorities in Iraq's northern city of Mosul found the bodies of 20 soldiers who had been abducted by insurgents nearly a week ago. The discovery brings the total number of troops kidnapped and killed to 42 over the course of the past 2 days.
Kidnappings and executions have become the latest threat to an Iraqi soldier. The bodies of 20 soldiers were found just outside the Ain al-Jahash base south of Mosul. These men were returning to their base in the northern Nineveh province when a large contingent of militants abducted them on May 5. A medical official said that 11 of the troops had had their hands tied behind their backs before being shot at close range in the head. Police said that the others died during the abduction. The Al-Qaeda offshoot of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant claimed responsibility for the unprecedented attack. This brings the total number of soldiers killed in such a way to 42. Earlier, the 22 soldiers who had been kidnapped in Fallujah on Friday were also killed before their bodies were dumped on the streets on Saturday night. The increased targeting of Iraqi security personnel comes as the army continues its operation to clear Fallujah of militants. Now into its fourth day, the military took control of the Nuaymiyah area south of Fallujah and prepared to break into the Shuhada neighborhood inside the city. It will be the first time in 4 months that the Iraqi army has had any presence inside the city, which has been under ISIL control since January. It remains to be seen, however, if this operation can actually bring much-needed respite for the Iraqi population from regular shootings, suicide attacks, and bombing campaigns by the extremist fighters.
Syria's Supreme Constitutional Court announced that campaigning for the country's presidential election slated for June 3rd has kicked off on Sunday. The polls, which come amid an ongoing conflict, will mark the first multi-candidate elections in Syria.
buildings, checkpoints and billboards in the Syrian capital are festooned with fresh portraits of President Bashar al-Assad, one of the three candidates contesting the upcoming polls for Syria's top job. And while once drab storefronts have been enlivened with new coats of paint in the national colors, energetic rallies praise the incumbent as the indispensable foe of terrorism.
The elections are legal. Every country will do the same. I will vote for President Bashar al-Assad.
Assad's two competitors are 43-year-old Maher Abdulhafiz Hajjar from the opposition People's Well Party and Hassan Abdullah al-Nouri, a 54-year-old member of the Syrian parliament.
Maher
Abdulhafiz Hajjar, Hassan bin Abdullah al-Nouri, Bashar Hafiz al-Assad. This announcement marks the beginning of the three candidates' election campaign from Sunday.
Reports say Hajjar, born to a prominent religious family in Aleppo, used to be a member of the Syrian Communist Party. He was elected a member of parliament in 2012 as an independent candidate. Another contender, al-Nouri, who holds a PhD from the John F. Kennedy University in the U.S., previously served as a Minister of State for Administrative Development Affairs from 2000 to 2002. He founded the opposition party National Initiative for Administration and Change in Syria in the wake of Syria's crisis. The vote will be Syria's first multi-candidate presidential election, but the incumbent, who is facing two other presidential hopefuls, is expected to secure a third term in office.
I surely will vote. This is our right. This is our country. I will vote and make my country get on the track which we expected through elections.
Analysts assert that the election is intended to send a message of Assad's strength and resolve to Damascus's friends and enemies alike, at a time when events on the battlefield have been going in the government's favor.
The Israelis have declared part of the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights a closed military zone, apparently fearing that battles on the Syrian side would spill over the ceasefire line. An army spokeswoman told AFP that the area around the Koneitra crossing was closed for security reasons. Security sources added that fighting between the Syrian army and militant groups, which the Israelis have been openly backing, may affect the occupied area. Meanwhile, the opposition-backed Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has reported that more than 100,000 civilians have fled Syria's eastern province of Deir ez-Zor as a result of the ongoing fighting between rival militant factions. The fighting between Al-Qaeda-linked Nusra Front and the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant has also killed 230 militants over the past 10 days. The oil-rich province of Deir ez-Zor, which borders Iraq, has been the scene of fierce clashes between the two militant groups since late April. You're watching Al Ittijah World News, still to come. South Sudan's rival factions trade blame over breaching a ceasefire agreement. Welcome back to Ali Tijah World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Vote counting gets underway after an independence referendum in Ukraine's eastern regions. Forces loyal to Kiev press on with their anti-terrorist operations in eastern Ukraine, seizing polling stations and shooting unarmed civilians. Iran's supreme leader slams Western expectations for Tehran to curb its missile development, calling it stupid and idiotic. And over 40 Iraqi soldiers are killed after being abducted in separate militant attacks. Just hours after it came into effect, a ceasefire deal to end the 5-month civil war in South Sudan has been broken. The South Sudanese government and rebels traded blame over the breaching of that ceasefire. The rebels accused government soldiers of launching ground attacks and artillery barrages against their positions in 2 oil-rich northern states, while the government insisted that it was the rebels who attacked first. At least 15 people have been killed in a spate of militant attacks against Yemen's security forces. 3 Al-Qaeda fighters were killed when they tried to attack a security checkpoint in the Yemeni capital Sana'a near the presidential palace. A civilian was also killed in the ensuing clashes. Meanwhile, 11 Yemeni soldiers died after a suicide bomber rammed an explosive-laden car into a military police base in Mokala in southeastern Yemen. The Israelis have approved a new piece of legislation aimed at denying amnesty to Palestinian detainees, a move that will impede any efforts to restart the so-called Middle East peace talks. The bill would enable judges handing down life sentences to detainees to declare them ineligible for presidential pardons. At least 40 people have died after a boat carrying mostly sub-Saharan African migrants sank off Libya's coast east of Tripoli. According to the Libyan government, 51 people were rescued. The accident took place shortly after the makeshift boat carrying 130 people left the beach. Staying in Libya, where the son of ousted leader Muammar Gaddafi, Saif al-Islam, appeared before a trial court via video link, facing charges ranging from war crimes to corruption. Saif's trial, along with 37 senior officials of the former regime, was adjourned to May 25th. Among the defendants who appeared before the court was former intelligence chief Abdullah al-Senussi. An Egyptian court handed out 4-year prison sentences to 36 students from the prestigious Al-Azhar University over taking part in violent anti-government protests. The 36 students who were calling for the reinstatement of Israel's President Mohamed Morsi were found guilty of rioting and blocking roads in December of last year. While campaigning for Egypt's presidential seat is heating up, with recent polls showing a closer than expected race. Karim Azzeddin filed this report from Cairo.
Campaigning in Egypt's presidential elections is heating up, as the 2 candidates step up their public appearances outlining their agendas. Although former army chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is widely expected to secure a victory, his challenger, the leftist Hamdin Sabahi, has seen his popularity steadily rising in recent weeks. Sabahi, whose campaign touched on several pressing issues, including the deteriorating economic situation, claims to have a vision and a strategy to lower the unemployment rate, solve the power crisis, and resolve the political polarization.
I've decided to vote for Hamdin Sabahi, as he's aware of Egyptian suffering. He's been fighting corruption for over 45 years, which qualifies him to run the country.
Hamdin Sabahi is a revolutionary figure, as he took part in the Egyptian revolution. He's one of us. I consider myself one of the poor, and I believe his presidential agenda matches my aspirations.
Others, however, credited Sabahi's rival with taking concrete steps towards addressing Egypt's economic vows.
I decided to vote for al-Sisi. With all due respect to Hamdan Sabahi, Egypt does not need an agenda. It needs actual steps that would push the country forward.
Field Marshal Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has rescued us from a political rock bottom. He sacrificed himself, and this is the actual proof of his patriotism.
There are those in Egypt who have decided to boycott the election process altogether, expressing their doubt over the qualification of both candidates. And now, as the country finds itself in the worst political and economic crisis in decades, it remains to be seen if any of the promises made during this campaign will translate into real progress for the Egyptians. The presidential poll is heating up as the two candidates are trying their best to gather as many votes as possible to win Egypt's top post. But will Egyptians settle down for a candidate with a military background, or will they settle down for a candidate with a civilian one? A question only time can answer. Reporting for Al-Ittiqa TV from Cairo, Karim Azzuddin.
Political analyst Omar Ismail joins us now via Skype from London. Mr. Ismail, will the outcome of these elections have a significant effect on Egypt's most pressing problems, economy and security?
It will certainly have a huge impact. The result is really for any of the candidates that are standing for election, it's really immaterial, in my view, who is going to be the president. The pressing needs of the economic reforms, the education system, the health system, the almost collapse of the economy of the country, the state of absolute. I don't want to say frozen government, because I don't think this government is doing anything at all to resolve the problems that the Egyptians are suffering from. So really, there is a huge tasks in front of the incoming president, and it will be very interesting to see how would any of the candidates will deal with the others once the result is known.
Yes, is Sisi using the anti-brotherhood stance in his campaign to distract Egyptians from more important issues such as the growing rate of poverty, which some say stands at 40 million?
Yeah, not only the rate of people who are under the what is termed as the poverty lines. I think there are more than 40% of the Egyptian people. I think the last figures that I have seen, it touches on a 60%, and that represents a huge challenge for anybody that is coming in, because the expectations are too high. Both candidates really have to be very careful not to raise the expectation too much. Otherwise, they will not be able to manage those expectations from the segment of the Egyptian society that have suffered for years from neglect and lack of services and lack of consideration from a number of governments that I would say from Sadat's days, especially after the peace treaty with Israel, none of those governments from Sadat's time to now really have made any inroads in really addressing the issues of employment, the health, the education. In fact, it went from bad to worse, which is culminated in the 25th of January revolution.
So are we going to see another military regime with the SCAF granted more extra legal powers?
I'm holding my breath, and I'm hoping, like many patriot here in Egypt and here in Britain and elsewhere in the world, and also in Egypt, that would not be the case for for the military to get involved in ruling the government. 75%, in my view, 75% of the problems of the military, actually emanated from the fact that the military were in control of everything in Egypt, including the Egyptian zoo in Giza. Actually, the manager was the chief executive officer for that zoo was a general in the army, a retired general in the army. I didn't know nobody knows why he was there. He didn't come from a background of veteran background, but I think it's a job for those who at the regime at that time can trust. And I really would not see, and I would not like to see that the same thing again repeated, because that will result in another revolution. And I think now the Egyptians know, in general know the way to change governments. We have two ex-president in prisons, and we do not want a third one.
Yes, political analyst Omar Ismail, thank you for speaking to Al Ittijah.
Good.
The front-runner in Afghanistan's presidential elections, Abdullah, has won the backing of a key rival, forming the contest's first major coalition. Zalmay Rasool, favoured by the outgoing President Hamid Karzai, pledged his support for Abdullah. The runoff vote, slated for mid-June, leaves Abdullah to face off with the former World Bank economist Ashraf Ghani. The African National Congress Party has won a landslide victory in South Africa's fifth democratic election, winning 62.2% of the vote. Responding to the result, President Jacob Zuma pledged to introduce reforms, adding that the victory reconfirmed how deeply rooted the ANC is in the hearts and minds of South Africans. Rallies were held in several North American cities in support of the more than 200 schoolgirls abducted in Nigeria. This as Nigeria's army stepped up its search for the missing girls amid global condemnation over the abductions.
US and Canadian citizens staged massive rallies over the abduction of more than 200 schoolgirls in Nigeria by the Islamist group Boko Haram. Those who took part in the rallies in Atlanta, New York City, and Toronto called for the release of the girls and an end to human trafficking worldwide.
I'm very pleased to know that the entire United States is behind, what's going on, and we're hoping that this will bring the girls home.
In Toronto, the Nigerian community called on the Canadian government to lend support to the ongoing search efforts for the missing girls. On Saturday, the U.S. First Lady Michelle Obama joined on the global chorus of voicing calls for efforts to be stepped up to free the abducted girls.
And I want you to know that Barack has directed our government to do everything possible to support the Nigerian government's efforts to find these girls and bring them home.
Meanwhile, teams from the US, UK, and China arrived in Nigeria to assist with the search. For its part, the White House announced that military and civilian advisors are helping authorities in Nigeria, but added that armed forces would not be sent in for an attempted rescue. The Nigerian government announced that it was stepping up the hunt for hundreds of the schoolgirls, with 2 divisions of the country's military now stationed in the border regions close to Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. Boko Haram has carried out a wide range of attacks in northeast Nigeria over the years, including a campaign of bombings and massacres.
The Southeast Asian Summit has kicked off in Myanmar with rising tensions between China and its neighbours overshadowing the annual meeting.
An eventful week in the South China Sea has passed with maritime disputes reaching a new high. Now, China and its neighbours are seizing the opportunity to meet and express their concerns to one another at the ASEAN Annual Summit.
We are at a critical juncture and we need to make sure that all necessary steps in community building are taken in a timely manner for the realization of the Asian community.
The 10-member bloc's meeting in Myanmar had a congested agenda, but only one issue dominated the talks. Vietnam and the Philippines are concerned that Beijing is working to expand its control over the South China Sea, following China's relocation of a deep-water oil rig into territory claimed by Vietnam. In a rare show of defiance, around 1,000 Vietnamese staged a protest outside the Chinese embassy in the capital Hanoi, lifting banners and denouncing the Asian giant's position over the Paracel and the Spratly Islands.
Our country has been through years of war against an invasion. We want to use peaceful days, such as today, to live in stability and to move forward. But China keeps dragging us into war. We resent this, and it is against our will. We have to defend ourselves.
For its part, China has tried to play down the disputes, asserting that the rift between the member states is being blown out of proportion. A unified statement at the end of the talks, however, looks to be uncertain, which might indicate that the slogan of moving forward in unity to a peaceful and prosperous community will need a lot more work on the part of some of the bloc's members.
Two anti-government protesters have been injured after an unidentified attacker threw a grenade at anti-government protesters outside the Prime Minister's office in the Thai capital, Bangkok. Earlier this week, the country's constitutional court ousted former Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra and 9 ministers over charges relating to abuse of power. Since then, protesters have been rallying, calling for the removal of Shinawatra's entire government. Here's a recap of tonight's top stories. Vote counting gets underway after an independence referendum in Ukraine's eastern regions. Forces loyal to Kiev press on with their anti-terrorist operation in eastern Ukraine, seizing polling stations and shooting unarmed civilians. Iran's supreme leader slams Western expectations for Tehran to curb its missile development, calling it stupid and idiotic. And over 40 Iraqi soldiers are killed after being abducted in separate militant attacks. Well, that's all from me and the Al Jazeera News team. Thank you very much for watching and good night.